In January 1959, a group of experienced Soviet hikers prepared for an ambitious winter expedition into the northern Ural Mountains. They were young, experienced, and equipped for a difficult journey through one of the coldest and most isolated regions of the Soviet Union. Their destination was the remote mountainous region of Kholat Syakhl. The journey was slow and physically demanding, with deep snow, freezing temperatures, and difficult terrain forcing the group to carry everything they needed with them. As the expedition moved higher, the landscape became more exposed. Trees became fewer, the wind became stronger, and the surrounding mountains offered little protection from the weather. On the slope of Kholat Syakhl, the group decided to establish their tent rather than continue through the worsening conditions. They cut into the snow and created a small level area where the canvas shelter could be secured. By evening, the tent was established on the exposed mountainside. Inside, the hikers arranged their sleeping equipment, food, clothing, and personal belongings, preparing to spend another night in the wilderness. Nothing about the scene suggests that the hikers expected the night to become extraordinary. They had endured difficult conditions before, and the tent offered at least some protection from the freezing mountain weather. At some point during the night, something caused the group to leave the tent unexpectedly. Exactly what happened in those final moments remains one of the central mysteries of the case. The tent was later found with a cut opening made from the inside. The hikers had apparently left in a hurry, abandoning much of the equipment and clothing they would normally have needed to survive outside. Instead of remaining near the shelter, the group moved downhill into the darkness. In temperatures far below freezing, leaving the tent without adequate protection would have been an extremely dangerous decision. By morning, the tent would be found abandoned on the mountainside, while tracks led downhill toward the forest. What could have driven 9 experienced hikers to leave their shelter in such extreme conditions would remain unexplained for decades. The tracks descended from the tent toward a forested area several hundred meters below. In the darkness and bitter cold, the group was moving farther and farther away from the only shelter that could have protected them from the storm. The forest offered at least some protection from the wind. Near a large cedar tree, the hikers apparently attempted to create a small fire, suggesting that survival rather than escape may have been their immediate priority. A small fire was later found beneath a cedar tree. Its presence became one of the important clues in the investigation, because it indicated that at least some of the group had tried to survive the freezing night in the forest. At some point, the group appears to have separated. The exact sequence is uncertain, but evidence later suggested that several members ended up farther into the forest, near a ravine where the terrain became lower and more sheltered. The ravine was colder and more difficult to navigate, but its lower position provided some protection from the wind. Somewhere in this area, several members of the group would later be discovered. When the group failed to return, concern quickly turned into a search. Because the expedition was in an isolated region and winter conditions were severe, rescuers could not immediately reach the mountain. Search teams eventually reached the area. What they found was deeply unsettling. The expedition tent was still standing, but the hikers themselves were nowhere to be seen. Inside the tent, many of the group's belongings were still there. Warm clothing, footwear, food and equipment had been left behind, making the decision to leave the shelter even harder to understand. The condition of the tent suggested that the departure had been sudden. The hikers had not packed normally, and some had gone outside without the clothing necessary for the extreme cold. The tracks provided the first major physical clue. They led away from the tent and downhill toward the forest, creating a timeline that investigators could begin to reconstruct from the snow itself. Near a large cedar tree, they found the remains of a small fire. This was an important discovery. It showed that at least some of the hikers had reached the forest and attempted to keep warm. But the fire was only part of the story. The surrounding snow contained other clues, and the search continued deeper into the forest and toward a nearby ravine. Several of the remaining victims were eventually located in and around the ravine. Their injuries made the case even more difficult to explain, because they did not fit a simple story of exposure alone. Some of the victims suffered severe injuries, particularly around the chest and head. Investigators now had to consider whether the injuries came from an accident, the terrain, the snow, or another event. the geography of the mountain became crucial. The tent sat high on an exposed slope, while the forest, cedar tree, fire site, and ravine lay farther downhill. Every location had to be connected into one coherent sequence. One possibility would eventually attract serious scientific attention: unstable snow above the tent. But the idea was not simply a dramatic avalanche sweeping down the mountain. A later scientific model proposed that cutting into the slope to make the tent platform may have disturbed the snow layers. Strong winds could then have deposited more snow above the tent, increasing the load over time. In this model, a delayed snow slab release could have placed pressure on the tent. The hikers, fearing a larger collapse, may have cut their way out and moved downhill to a safer location. This theory can explain several puzzling details, including the sudden departure from the tent. But it remains a reconstruction, not a complete eyewitness account. The exact chain of events that followed is still uncertain. The proposed mechanism depends on several conditions occurring together. The slope had to be cut for the tent, wind had to move snow onto the area above it, and the unstable layer had to remain in place long enough to become dangerous. The mountain's wind could have acted like a conveyor belt, slowly moving loose snow uphill and depositing it where the terrain allowed it to accumulate. The danger would not necessarily have been obvious from inside the tent. Inside the tent, the hikers may have had little warning of what was happening outside. Then, if the snow shifted suddenly, the pressure on the shelter could have created a frightening and immediate emergency. If a slab of snow shifted onto the tent, the hikers could have believed that a larger collapse was possible. In that situation, getting outside quickly may have seemed safer than remaining beneath the slope. Whatever the exact trigger was, the group left the tent without taking the equipment that would normally have been essential for survival. That single decision became one of the most important clues in the entire mystery. The descent would have taken them farther from the tent and deeper into the cold. Once the group reached the trees, they would have had to find another way to stay warm and protected. At the cedar, the fire offered a fragile source of warmth. But a small fire could not easily compensate for the severe cold, especially when some members of the group were inadequately dressed. The group may have tried to use the ravine as a more sheltered location. But the terrain there was uneven, and the deep snow concealed hazards that were difficult to see in darkness. What happened next cannot be reconstructed with complete certainty. The surviving physical evidence tells us where people were found, but not every movement or decision that came before their deaths. Investigators now had to determine whether the hikers had left voluntarily, been forced out by the environment, or encountered something they could not control. The physical scene offered clues, but very few definitive answers. The abandoned belongings were especially important. The tent still contained items that would have been extremely useful outside, suggesting that the departure had happened under unusual pressure rather than as a normal decision to relocate the camp. The tracks were another critical piece of evidence. They appeared to lead downhill, away from the tent, and their direction helped establish that the forest was not simply an unrelated location discovered later. The distance between the tent and the forest was not enormous, but in deep snow, darkness, and extreme cold, even that distance could become dangerous. Every step away from shelter increased the risk of exposure. Exposure alone could explain why the cold became fatal. Without adequate clothing, the body gradually loses heat, and once hypothermia becomes severe, survival becomes increasingly difficult. But the ravine complicated the picture. Some victims had suffered serious blunt force injuries, raising the possibility that terrain or falling snow had played a role in what happened. A fall into uneven terrain could produce serious injuries without requiring any human attacker. Snow and branches could also conceal a person from view, making the search more difficult and delaying discovery. By combining these locations, investigators could reconstruct a broad sequence: an emergency at the tent, a retreat downhill, an attempt to survive in the forest, and eventually a series of deaths caused by circumstances that remained unclear. The upper slope became increasingly important to later explanations. If snow had accumulated above the tent and become unstable, it could potentially explain why the hikers reacted so suddenly. Modern research has offered a plausible natural explanation involving a delayed snow slab. It can connect the tent, the sudden evacuation, the slope, and the injuries without requiring a supernatural event. But plausibility is not the same as absolute proof. The important detail is scale. The proposed event was not a massive avalanche sweeping an entire mountainside away. It was a much more localized slab of snow capable of creating pressure around the tent. If the hikers believed another collapse could follow, their priority may have shifted from protecting their belongings to getting away from the slope. That could explain why essential equipment was left behind. Once they moved downhill, however, another problem appeared. Without adequate clothing or shelter, every minute outside would have increased their exposure to the cold. At the Cedar, the group apparently tried to create a temporary survival point. The fire suggests planning and cooperation, but the available fuel and protection were limited. The cedar itself may have provided fuel for the fire. But obtaining enough dry wood in a frozen forest at night would have been difficult, and the effort could have exposed the hikers to even more cold. At some point, the group appears to have become divided between the fire area and the ravine. Whether this was deliberate or caused by confusion in the darkness is impossible to establish with certainty. The ravine offered shelter from the wind, but it also contained uneven ground and deep snow. A fall or collapse there could have caused serious injuries without leaving an obvious explanation on the surface. When the search teams later examined the ravine, they found evidence that some of the deaths were associated with significant physical trauma. The question was whether the trauma came from the terrain, snow movement, or another cause. The evidence therefore points towards several possible natural processes rather than one simple event. Cold exposure, difficult terrain, and physical trauma could all have contributed at different stages. The Dyatlov Pass mystery survives because the mountain preserves only fragments of the story. The tent tells us where the crisis began. The tracks tell us where the hikers went. And the forest and ravine reveal only part of what happened afterward. Years later, the upper slope became central to a different interpretation of the case. Researchers asked whether the snow above the tent could have become unstable after the hikers cut into the slope to create their campsite. The proposed mechanism involves wind. Snow carried across the exposed mountain could have accumulated above the tent, gradually increasing the load on an already disturbed section of the snowpack. Eventually, that accumulated snow could have reached a point where the slab became unstable. A limited release would have been enough to create pressure and panic without producing the enormous avalanche people often imagine. If they believed the tent was in danger, leaving immediately would have been understandable. The strange part was what happened afterward. Instead of returning once the immediate danger passed, they continued downhill. The forest was their best chance of escaping the exposed wind. But by moving away from the tent, they also moved away from their sleeping bags, food, tools, and most of their warm clothing. Under the cedar, the hikers appear to have tried to solve the immediate problem of warmth. A fire could help, but it could not replace the protection of a proper winter shelter. At some point, the group seems to have split between the fire area and the ravine. The reasons are unknown, but the separation made an already dangerous situation even harder to survive. The ravine may have provided shelter, but it also introduced another danger. Deep snow can hide uneven ground, and a fall can become serious when people are already weakened by extreme cold. Put together, the evidence suggests a chain of events rather than one mysterious moment: an emergency at the tent, a retreat downhill, an attempt to survive in the forest, and finally the deadly effects of cold, injury, and exposure. The investigation could establish many physical facts, but physical facts do not always reveal the exact sequence of human decisions. That distinction is what makes the Dyatlov Pass case so difficult. One of the most striking facts was the cut in the canvas. The opening suggested an emergency exit, but by itself it could not reveal exactly what the hikers believed was happening outside. The modern snow-slab hypothesis does not claim to explain every detail. It proposes one plausible trigger for the sudden evacuation and leaves the later events to other natural processes. The fire remains are another piece of the puzzle. They show an attempt to survive, but they do not tell us exactly who made the fire, how long it burned, or what decisions were made afterward. The ravine adds another layer of uncertainty. Serious injuries were documented, but the physical environment provides several natural ways in which those injuries might have occurred. The strongest modern natural explanation therefore works as a sequence. Snow instability may have triggered the evacuation, while cold, terrain, and injuries may have determined what happened afterward. It is a plausible reconstruction, not a perfect record of the night. More than 6 decades later, the mountain remains largely the same: exposed slopes above, dense forest below, and a vast landscape that can quickly become hostile in winter. The people at the center of the story were not characters in a supernatural tale. They were real young hikers who entered the mountains expecting a difficult expedition and never returned. So what really happened at Dyatlov Pass? The evidence increasingly points toward a natural chain of events, with a possible snow-slab disturbance followed by exposure, difficult terrain, and injury. But some details remain uncertain. And that uncertainty is why the mystery of Dyatlov Pass still fascinates the world today.